There is an episode on my podcast where I talk about this, about how when you go for research adjacent jobs, often you're being scored. So it might be that there is a line in the job description that says like excellent communication skills. And if you just say, I have excellent communication skills, that might get you like a 1. But what's going to get you like a 5 is if you say, when I was doing my PhD, I organised an outreach project for some local school children, and we did these things, and this was the outcome of doing that. And whether you need it for the job application or whether you need it for the interview, when you go for research adjacent jobs, it's all about give an example of a time when you have helped to be part of a team to make something happen. Give an example of a time when you've dealt with like a really challenging situation. And it's looking for those really concrete examples. Then nobody's going to ask about your qualifications again. They're not interested. They don't particularly want to hear about your research either, unless you can tell, again, a really compelling story about how you demonstrated some of these skills through the research, or through how you shared the research, or dealt with a challenging situation that came up during the research. So yes, incredibly important to do that.
Welcome to this special episode of Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD. This is a two-sided episode, and you'll see what this means as we talk. Today, I have the great pleasure of having with me Sarah McLusky of the Research Adjacent podcast. Sarah McLusky is a freelance consultant, trainer and facilitator specializing in research events and communication. Sarah launched the Research Adjacent podcast in 2023, and it's a podcast celebrating all the amazing people who go into making research successful and not just researchers. So the name is great. I love the name of the podcast, and it really says what it is. In the podcast, Sarah shares career stories and strategies to help people thrive in a research-adjacent career, in their research-adjacent careers. And she has been herself research-adjacent for over 20 years. She has worked for universities and research projects, science centers and museums, and learned societies and education providers. Sarah's academic background is in plant pathology and biochemistry, but she has worked across a huge range of disciplines, including all the sciences plus the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Sarah McLusky, welcome to Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD.
Oh, thank you very much for that welcome. It makes it sound like I've really been round the houses, but yeah, I've been at this stuff for a long time now. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, Sarah, research adjacent, like I said, I love the name of the podcast. And it's interesting that, it's really, anyway, I'm super happy to have you here today, because I think this research adjacent space is somewhat opaque to a lot of people, especially people just coming out of graduate school.
Yeah.
And the people I have talked with who are now like in research adjacent jobs have kind of found about it, often serendipitously, or in a very sometimes convoluted ways, with a lot of randomness and not too much of a linear path towards it. Of course, like thinking of myself, I got into the PhD thinking of teaching and doing research, and then, never looked, and also never, no one ever presented me all the careers that could come after the PhD, including this research adjacent space. Can you talk a little bit about it, and about, if you can also kind of share how that space caught your interest and led you to starting the podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to say about it is that if people have never heard about research adjacent space before, partly because I made it up. So that's, it's not a term that, as you said, you like the name. And it's partly because I found myself, the name came from, I was organising a careers panel and for PhD students and early career postdocs. And they wanted people who were doing jobs that were not in academia. And so I had to come up with a name for the careers panel. And the name, I just was out for a walk one day. It's how these things happen, isn't it? It kind of popped into my head. I was like, research adjacent, oh, that's good. So we'll call it that. So I called the careers panel that. And then actually I was just like, this name is too good. I have to do something with this name. And it really fitted in with a bit of a passion that I had at the time, which I guess is kind of, there's a bit of a story there. So I've been doing these jobs without having a name for them for about 25 years now. So as you say, I did do a PhD. I did my PhD in the late 90s and did it without, I was one of those people who I did very well in my undergrad and everybody said I should do a PhD. So I did a PhD without really giving it much thought and without really having much of a career plan in mind. I think that I think my supervisor could probably see I was never really destined to be an academic, because whilst I was doing my PhD, I got sent on lots of courses. So to do things like, media training and science writing and things like that. And the world was slightly different then. And so when I came out of my PhD, there was also the tricky thing that I did an interdisciplinary PhD before it was fashionable. They're very fashionable now. They were not fashionable in the 90s. I was also doing a form of biochemistry, though it's biological chemistry really, which again, natural products and things like that, which was not fashionable in the 90s. It was all genetics. So when I came out of my PhD, I had like that experience. I think a lot of people do. I hadn't finished writing up. I'd run out of money. I had to go and get some jobs to keep me ticking along and wrote up my PhD on the weekends. And the jobs that came up, I had done a lot of work in customer service roles as I was studying. I had done like a bit of event management stuff for the Students' Union. So I had some of these skills to draw on. And that combination of kind of customer service, event management, science, communication, I ended up going into science centres and working in science centres, and started off on, minimum wage, just enough to pay the bills and get me through whilst I was writing up my thesis. And at that point, I still thought maybe I would go and do something in academia. But actually, I reached a bit of a crossroads where in almost the same week, I was offered a fast track job interview at AstraZeneca, big biotech company. Yeah. And I was offered a full-time education, science communication job. Oh, and wow. For, this is how we make decisions sometimes. And the science education job was in the north of England, and I'm from Scotland. If people might be able to tell if my accent might not, I'm from Scotland. The job was in the north of England. The biotech company job was in the south of England, and I wanted to stay nearer home. So I took the education job without really giving it much thought. But actually, that's still what I'm doing now, 25 years later, it's gone through various kind of guises, but still in that form. And I think what I would say is, so I never originally aspired to go into this kind of work. And the reason, as you said, that people maybe haven't heard of it, it's because a lot of these jobs didn't exist. So a lot of them are really new. Even 25 years ago when I was coming out of my PhD, only just then was science communication becoming a job. And at that point, there were no master's courses and things like that there are in it now. I was very lucky in the point that I was coming into it is that they were desperate for anybody who could do some of this stuff because it was exploding. So it got me a foot in the door at that point. But a lot of the jobs that there are now and the sorts of things that people that have on guest on Research Adjacent, they're jobs that have, on some degree, some of them have existed for a long time, like research management jobs, but some of them are very recent jobs. Like in the UK, there's a lot of stuff around research impact and knowledge exchange. And those jobs have only really existed for maybe 10 years. And that will be why people haven't heard of them. And they also, again, it's that thing that when people are in, and I know you've talked about this in previous episodes, when people are in that academic space, all they see around them are other academics. So they don't necessarily get that sense of what else might be out there. So really what led me down to start the Research Adjacent podcast was partly because I wanted to help people like who were coming out. I was working a lot with PhD students who were coming to the end of their studies and were just so lost in terms of what they wanted to do next. And they could see that there were no jobs. And it was particularly in the arts and humanities at that point in time. They could see that there was a real shortage of jobs. And I was on recruitment panels where we would get like 50 applicants for one job. And I wanted to do something which would help people like that and help them see that they had options and that they were hugely employable, and that knowledge of research could be really valuable in different roles. So partly there was that side of things and that real desire to help. The other thing was I had a little bit of a bee in my bonnet, and that is because these research adjacent jobs make a phenomenal contribution to research actually happening and being successful and getting out in the world and having an impact. But they don't get credit, and they don't get their names on papers, and they don't get career progression the same way. You know, there's no such thing as like tenure track or whatever for people in these research adjacent roles. And so they're just not getting credit in the same way. And I thought, what can I do to help shine a spotlight on these people and the incredible work that they do? And that's what led me to start those two things combined to start the Research Adjacent podcast.
It's an amazing story, and it's funny how it kind of aligns with the evolution also of the space. Like I said, because a lot of these things now, like I said, science communication or even science illustration now, there's master's courses around that. In my conversations on and off the podcast with people who are post PhD and doing different things, I have talked with people that are in the university that are contributing to, like you said, the research in different ways. So some of them helping the researchers with their grant writing, some of them with getting the science and the discoveries to go outside the walls of the university and to get talked about in news or on different platforms. And also there's people who are working in policy. It can be at the level of the university, but also in someone in the States who's actually working at the federal level in terms of university policy. And these are all people who love staying adjacent, staying abreast of what's happening in research, but who no longer are at the lab. And while I was in graduate school, like you said, I never heard of them. For me, it was the graduate students, the lab technicians, the postdocs, the PI, and that's what makes university. And then I discover that there's a host of people who are really, working their ass off to get the grants funded sorry, should I not have said that is your...
No, that's absolutely fine. Yeah. We don't need to be PG.
So a host of people who are passionate about science, passionate about research, but who chose to not go the way of actually being a PI and being a researcher, etc., but to contribute in a different way. And so from in that point of view, can you please, for the people who are listening and who think, oh, this actually could be interesting for me, because I do want to stay close to academia. Can you, because you mentioned two things. You mentioned research managers and you mentioned science communication type offices. What other job descriptions or job names are there that people don't know about that could be really good fits for them?
Yeah, there's so much out there. And I think that even when I started the podcast, I don't think I'd quite got my head around how much was out there. I tend to think of these roles and in two kind of camps, and you've indicated them really nicely there. There's the jobs that are involved in making research happen. So that might be the research managers and administrators. That might be people who work on grant funding and things like that. It might even be people who do support roles like technicians or looking after people who work in the library, people who are doing software, things like that, and looking after health and safety, all that sort of stuff that helps the research to get done on that kind of practical role, that sort of internal sense. And then there's all the roles which are about taking research out into the world. And that includes the communication type roles that we've talked about, which is certainly the route I started through. And I know that's the route that you've come through as well. But there are policy jobs, as you've mentioned. There are people who work in what in the UK we call impact, but that can be around building partnerships with people who are outside of the university or the research organization, because I'll come to that in a minute. It's not just about universities as well. So there's people involved in doing partnerships. There might be people who are doing, helping industrial relationships for like university spin out companies and startups and things like that. So there's all those people that are involved in making research happen. And I mean, I've had people in the podcast, things like people who are lawyers who work on intellectual property, people who are exhibition designers who make exhibitions that are based on research. I've had people who work in archives and museums. Just the range of roles is absolutely vast. And there's something for everybody depending on what it is that they're interested in. And then, as I say, the other thing that's really interesting as well is that these jobs are not just in universities. So they are also in places like government. So as you said, the kind of policy jobs, library, information services, all that kind of stuff in the UK. We've got some civil service research organisations. So there's places like what we call DEFRA, but it's like agriculture agencies and environment agencies and things like that. There's people working there. There are charities, particularly medical charities, that have people involved in research, communication type roles, also in funding roles, all sorts of stuff. So museums, local councils, it's not just about higher education. And I think that's another thing that's really interesting. And the thing about all these roles is that having an understanding of the research, an understanding of the process of how research works can be really, really helpful. It's by no means essential. And I would say that about 50% of the people that I interview on my podcast don't have PhDs, but about 50% of them do. And having that knowledge of research can help you to understand the process, get up to speed very quickly. And I've often seen people with PhDs get promoted very quickly in these roles, even if they have to start kind of at the entry level if it's something that's a bit new to them. So yeah, that's a bit of an overview of everything that's out there.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I was going to ask you a question that you ended up answering, which was where do PhDs fit and why? And you just said it. But now you just finished with something that it's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, but it's very important, which is because there is no straight path. Maybe, 10, 20, 30 years from now, there'll be more like bridges built to, from the PhD to specific spaces in the ecosystem, in the different ecosystems. But today, because these bridges don't happen, you as a PhD need to advocate for yourself. You need to learn how to talk with these people. My take is that the best way to learn is to, before you're looking for a job, talk with people who are doing those things and learn and hear how they talk and hear what terms they use. But today, especially if you're going into maybe a position that's brand new, maybe a position where or a place where the PhDs are not traditionally hired, one of the things that will happen is that the pay for that first job will probably not reach what you had envisioned for yourself at the end of the degree. Thinking, now I have this degree, it's the best degree, so now I can make this much per year and da 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 da. And you mentioned this question, and like I said, it's often depending on the personality of the candidates. It can be a hard pill to swallow of starting at an entry level and then evolving.
Yeah.
Do you have more reflections on that,
sure.
and how to navigate that, and how to have those conversations in a way that actually leads you to to a good outcome, and to not exclude yourself, because what people do is like, oh, this is too low, I'm excluding this, and then they are maybe losing a great opportunity because they would then evolve quickly.
Yes, I think that's it. So, it can be, as you say, a bitter pill to swallow. But if you're looking at these things, you need to look at it, even though there might be research in the job title. So say it's like a research manager job. Just because it's got research manager job in it, you might know the research bit. That doesn't mean you know the manager bit. And I think it's really important to separate those things and recognize that, yes, you've got transferable skills, and PhD students, PhD graduates have got incredible transferable skills, but you need to learn how to transfer them, and you need to learn how to take those skills and use them in a different setting. And sometimes I would say to people is like, which of these things would you prefer? Hanging around for a year, applying for jobs and not getting anywhere, or maybe going into a job that is at a lower grade, but that you can get experience, you can get to know people, you can get a foot in the door, and you will get promoted quickly. And certainly when I finished my PhD, I couldn't afford not to. So my first jobs out of my PhD were pretty much minimum wage, but I got a foot in the door, I got experience, I got promoted very quickly. And so sometimes swallowing your pride, going into it, this advice I give with anything, PhD graduates, one of the main skills you've got is curiosity, because that's what led you into doing a PhD in the first place. And I think it's always encouraging people of how you can approach your career path with a bit of curiosity and think about what can I learn in any situation. And even when I did voluntary work as well to get experience when I was coming out of my PhD. And you can learn something from every opportunity if you go into it with an open mind. And I think that's really important. But I always will counsel people, you probably will have to start at a lower level, but you probably get promoted quickly. But you can get promoted to kind of similar levels. So to keep it in a university, if that's what's familiar to people, a project manager role, so like a research project manager, will probably be paid about the same as a research assistant. Then a research manager is probably similar to like an assistant professor. And then once you can get up to kind of, heads of units and things like that, and then you'll be starting to get paid at the same level as a professor. So, there's opportunities there. It doesn't mean that you're destined to be on minimum wage forever, but you have to go through the process and demonstrate your skills. And it's because, I know this is something you talk about a lot on your podcast as well, is I have had people, I've done a lot of recruitment, I've been on a lot of recruitment panels, and you get people who apply with a PhD just assuming that the PhD is enough and that I'm somehow going to know, look, I managed a PhD project, so therefore I can manage this project. But it's up to you, up to the candidate to show that, to demonstrate, to think about the examples of how they can demonstrate their project management skills. And it's not as straightforward as just, here's my PhD certificate, give me a job. It's still thinking about how you transfer those skills over. And really thinking about those transferable skills is how people will find the right niche for them. Because as I said, this is a huge area of work where having the research knowledge is really valuable, but you might have amazing, communication skills might be your special thing. So you might look at, the communications, research communication side of things. It may be that you're great on the kind of financial side of things. So maybe you look at, the research funding or the finance management side of things. It may be that you're really good at connecting people and building partnerships. So then you think, right, I'm going to look at these kind of knowledge exchange roles and policy roles and those sorts of things where there's lots of partnership working. So I think it's really important to do a bit of an inventory of like, what am I really good at? A, what am I really good at? And B, what do I really enjoy beyond just this subject matter that you've been studying for the last 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah. And I'd say, once you've done that work of telling up all of that, to try to find one or two stories from your graduate school journey that illustrate that, because some people you'll just say that and it'll still not be enough. They'll want to see, okay, but what does that look like in real life? How, do you have a story to illustrate that? And that's the next step, is look back and think, how can I demonstrate that I'm really good at connecting people? How can, if it's something that has been, transverse, or, my God, now the term eludes me and you've said it a bunch and I know it, but a transferable skill, if you want to talk about a transferable skill, you cannot just name it. You need to illustrate it through some story, some narrative. And so, so when I was in my, let's say, first year postdoc, I had this much budget with which I had these and these objectives, and I ended up reaching my objectives at 70% budget. So, you need to illustrate it. You need to do some more effort in making tangible how you did those things that you're saying you did.
Yeah, and I've talked about it. I won't go loads into it. There is an episode of my podcast where I talk about this, about how when you go for research adjacent jobs, often you're being scored. So often your application is being literally marked out of whatever, depending on what they're looking for. And that's exactly what they look like. So it might be that there is a line in the job title, that's in job description, that says excellent communication skills. And if you just say, I have excellent communication skills, then that, that might get you a 1. But what's going to get you a 5 is if you say, when I was doing my PhD, I organised an outreach project for some local school children, and we did these things, and this was the outcome of doing that. And then it'd be like, oh yeah, actually, they've demonstrated their communication skills there, and then you would get a higher mark if you give that example of how you've done it. And whether you need it for the job application or whether you need it for the interview, when you go for research adjacent jobs, it's all about that. So it's all about give an example of a time when you have helped to be part of a team to make something happen. Give an example of a time when you've dealt with a really challenging situation. And it's looking for those really concrete examples. Nobody, if you've got, once you get, maybe they might look for on the list, it might say, oh, you need a degree, but that would just be tech, whatever. Then nobody's going to ask about your qualifications again. They're not interested. They don't particularly want to hear about your research either, unless you can tell, again, a really compelling story about how you shared, how you demonstrated some of these skills through the research, or through how you shared the research, or dealt with a challenging situation that came up during the research. So so that's incredibly important to do that.
Yeah, and it applies to any, well, first I would say it's important even for people who stay in academia, but it gets more and more important because of the distance and the culture mismatch. It's more and more important the less adjacent you are, the more you go into industry, etc. You really need to do more of that work and do more effort retelling or learning how to tell that story. Sarah, we are going, we have a few minutes left, but I have a few, one more question for you. For that last question, I know of your podcast, but people who are listening maybe don't, and of what you do either. So I'd really like you to take a couple of minutes, saying where people can find you, your, be it on LinkedIn, etc., but also your podcast and then on all the other places you're at, so that they can explore research adjacent and they can actually learn more about you and what motivates you, but also what they can learn from you and how you can help them if they
absolutely. So the podcast is Research Adjacent. You'll find it on any podcast app. If you just search Research Adjacent, you will find it. The website is researchadjacent.com, and that's where you will find all the back catalogue and things like that. And now the back catalogue is getting quite sizable, so there is a little quiz on the website as well, which is if you go to researchadjacent.com/quiz, and you can answer some questions about things like your transferable skills, what you're interested in, and it will give you some suggestions of certain podcasts that might be interesting for you. And it also will help to potentially narrow down the areas of research adjacent work that you might be interested in. So that's a really good place to go and check out if people are just not sure where to start, if it's all a bit much. All of the people who have guested on the podcast will be really happy when you say about reaching out to people who've done it before. Everybody who's been on the podcast will be really happy for people to get in touch with them, ask questions about their job, and just find out a bit more. So if there is something that piques your interest, then definitely go and connect with them. And the same goes for me as well. I'm really happy to help people in any way I can. The main place I hang out is on LinkedIn. So it's Sarah McLusky. The main tricky thing is to get the right spelling of my surname, which is as short as you can possibly make it, McLusky. And then you will track me down on LinkedIn and come and connect and say hello there. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful. So those links will all be in the show notes. Now, my last question. One thing we've mentioned a few times in the last few minutes has been transferable skills. And with all your experience, your user experience in the space, and your experience also with the podcast and these conversations, I'm always interested in people who are doing the type of work we're doing, in my guests' reflections about what are key transferable skills for the years to come. Because like you said, your job didn't exist when you started it back then, when you finished a PhD. And again, today, people who are in graduate school, very probably the exact job they're going to do in 3, 4, or 5 years is not something that exists yet in that complete form. Maybe there's something that's kind of emerging towards that. But so also key or important or valued transferable skills also evolve.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, a couple of things, definitely. So yeah, certainly there's a lot of people in the research adjacent world at the moment a little bit nervous about AI, particularly when it comes to things like, writing and so on. I'm not hugely worried about it. Maybe I'm in denial, but I'm not hugely worried about it. But it's so, yeah, but as you say, thinking about it from that point of view is what are the skills that are going to endure? And I think the main things I would say, particularly from just life and also research adjacent, curiosity, I would say, is the number one thing. And it relates to other things like growth mindset and so on. But always trying to go into a situation and just thinking, what can I learn here? And even when it's a challenging situation, I'm just thinking about what's the lesson? What can I learn? What can I get out of it? So I think that is an incredibly valuable skill to cultivate. Also just flexibility, which I think is really important. A lot of people in the research adjacent world do jobs where they do a bit of everything. So being willing to get stuck in, give it a go, being flexible, being willing to maybe try something and have it not work out the first time, but just giving it a go. As we said, we both started podcasts in pretty much that way. It's just like, let's see what we can learn from it. Let's just give it a go and see what happens, and we'll learn as we go. So I think that curiosity and flexibility are probably the biggest ones. And then a huge number, and this comes up loads with guests in my podcast, a huge number of research adjacent roles are really about people. So they might on the surface be about, doing grant applications or something like that. But at the end of the day, it's about how do you convince somebody? How do you tell a story that's compelling to another person? How do you help to support somebody through that journey? How do you build those partnerships that are going to be essential? And I think those interpersonal skills are incredibly important, because also as we do see this increase in AI, what we're going to be drawn to more and more, and what's going to be more and more important at work is people and how we interact with each other. So I think that's the other one that I would say is really important.
Mm-hmm. I love it. So curiosity, flexibility, and people, interpersonal skills. I love these three. I think they're a great way kind of close this conversation, to end this part of the interview. Sarah, thank you so much. It's been great. I love your story. I love the way you put your energy into your work, and the passion is clear. And I really appreciate having had the opportunity to chat with you in this special two-sided episode.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been an honor. It's been really fun. Yeah, thank you.